So we'll get started in just a moment. I just want to give people a chance to get into the talk. Okay. So I think I'm going to go ahead and get started because we have a lot to talk about today. So good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Kristen Chiacha. I'm the Executive Director and Chief Curator of Second Street Gallery. We're a 501c3 nonprofit art space located in Charlottesville, Virginia. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Monacan Nation, the traditional custodians of the land I am tuning in from today, and pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Welcome to tonight's Artists in Conversation on the occasion of LaRissa Rogers' current exhibition at Second Street Gallery on Belonging, the Space in Between. And I just shared a link with everyone in the chat in case you wanted to read more about the exhibition as we get started. Just a bit of housekeeping. This is a Zoom webinar, so you can see and hear us, but we cannot see or hear you. So you can sit back and relax. We'll have an open Q&A session at the end of the talk, so please feel free to enter your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We're also recording tonight's talk, and we'll post a link to Second Street Gallery's website in the next couple of days. So don't worry if you have to leave early. So I'm now going to hand the floor over to LaRissa and the other artists for brief introductions. There's a lot to talk about tonight, and I don't want to waste any more time. So thank you, LaRissa.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Kristen, for that introduction. I'm tuning in from LA, which is Chumash territory. I just a few days ago got back from a road trip that I made to actually get to Virginia to install this show, which I'll be talking about. I'm so happy to have Jackie, Luis, and John in conversation with me. So I'll quickly just walk through the show and some key themes behind it, and then pass it along, and then we'll start conversation a little bit later. So for the show at Second Street, as I mentioned, I did a road trip, first beginning in LA, and road trip to Virginia. I did this road trip actually with Jackie, who will be speaking a little bit later. And I did this road trip to start kind of like gathering the materials for the show, thinking through kind of like place, belonging, and movement, specifically flight as it pertains to kind of like diasporic resilience. So we stopped at the borderline of each state that we crossed through, kind of like thinking about that hybrid in between kind of like unknown space is one that I feel like I'm working in a lot in my practice. And when not only like kind of like thinking about this movement, but also thinking about how it pertains kind of like to my identity. So that's the soil that you see, like that created these soil slabs. And I'm thinking about this work kind of as one work, more as a triptych. And I also traveled with some of the bases that I'm using to support these soil slabs that then have images and sometimes other organic material embedded within them. So one of the bases is made out of sugar, candied sugar. One is made out of porcelain and the other is made out of sod. I actually traveled with the candied sugar, which is about like a 500-pound block, hollowed block of sugar that I traveled with me to actually get to the show in Virginia. And that you'll see if you've seen the show has started to kind of disintegrate and transform over the time of the show, and it started to melt. And I was like really interested, I guess, in using these two materials, I guess, porcelain and sugar, in relationship to the soil, not only kind of speaking to the history of the interconnectedness of sugar and porcelain, which is kind of like goes back to during the 18th and 19th centuries, when the upper class European elite would use sugar pastelage as these table decorations. And they were kind of like this status symbol that was then something to kind of like be admired, but not eaten, and then fed to the lower class or the slaves after these like elaborate banquets. But after sugar became easily accessible and kind of just started to spread into, you know, more lower class people, then they started to use porcelain instead. So I'm kind of like using these materials, not only kind of like connecting these shared history between porcelain and sugar and how they're aiding in capitalism and labor, but also thinking about kind of like these shared systems that are relating to like to, I guess, this to the diaspora, and specifically I'm thinking about how kind of that is influencing how I'm navigated in the histories and memories of my family. So some of the images that are embedded within some of these soil slabs are, these are just a few images that I pulled, and of many of the images that are embedded, but some of them are family photos, like really interested in thinking about kind of like this memory, or like how history and memory are maintained, or how, you know, they're passed down, and thinking that in relationship to amnesia and what gets remembered. And also, like, I guess something that was important for me is that, like, as some of these images, be it kind of like a family, my family portrait of like my parents getting married, or coolie workers, or Tiger Woods swinging a golf club, like I was interested in creating this constellation of like, kind of like, what does it mean to see like slaves working the sugar plantation using like a machete to cut the sugar cane, versus like the coolie worker and then the swing of the Tiger Woods, like kind of creating this constellation of stories, and that are all kind of like tie back to this these kind of like shared histories, which may seem dispersed but are also constantly kind of like influencing one another. And so in the materials list, which is something that isn't, I guess, as obvious when just seeing the show in person, I list kind of like the importance, and try to also thinking about this you know, tradition of storytelling, of trying to create kind of like this story within kind of like the way that these materials are also explained in that way. And that's just like a brief overview, and I'm going to pass it to Jackie to share a little bit of their work, and then we can talk about more themes later in the talk.
Thank you so much, LaRissa. Thanks everyone for joining us tonight. I'm actually in Chumash territory, joined from Los Angeles. And I'm gonna tell you a little bit about me. My practice is influenced by my relationship to borders and diaspora, and informed by my experiences as an immigrant woman. In my work, I engage with durational performances, site-specific immateriality, trying to create a language that navigates socio-political relationships. And I have prepared I'm going to share my screen. So in 2014, my family migrated from Guatemala to the United States seeking asylum. And I had to look for my family in ICE detention center website because during this time I was undocumented. So I bumped into this document that has the list of deaths of people detained and people who lost their life in ICE custody. And then I started to thinking about my experience in a detention center and also about all this erasure of stories and histories that immigrants are not able to share. And I started looking into all this list that ICE have in their website, and thinking about movement and thinking about place and how I wasn't able to navigate from one space into another for 15 years. I started thinking about soil as this like living archive that was collecting these stories and had all this history embedded in it. And my privilege of mobility from one place to another, I started traveling from different states in the United States and acquiring soil from border state lines that connected one state with another, and making a mixture of masa, which is corn and soil and salt, to create this casting of the names of the people who passed away in detention centers. So I started acquiring the soil in bottles of water, thinking of my experience of crossing the border and how this was served as a vessel. So I've been doing this for the last 2 years. So the process of making this work is casting the letters, putting them in the freezer, and then baking them at different temperatures. The soil has different consistencies, so I have to work individually with each soil to create the names. And here I'm using drywall and carving out the names of the people who lost their lives in detention centers, so I can later on put the names, the soil letters, embed them into this drywall. Currently, I have 216 names, but this list is constantly changing and growing. The documents that I'm using are specifically found at ice.gov. And this list was changed in 2018 during Trump administration. And from there, another list that is shorter was created, but there's a gap in between 2017 and 2018 where the names of a lot of people are missing. And this is my presentation, and I'm gonna pass it down to Luis.
Thank you, Jackie. Let me pull up my presentation for 1 second. All right, I have it. Can you see my screen? Yes. Okay, great. Hi, my name is Luis Vasquez La Roche. I'm an artist that mainly works in performance and sculpture. I'm currently in Kairiri and Alubera, now known as Trinidad and Tobago, land of the Taino and the Kalinago. My practice is interested in combining and collapsing research in different objects, materials, and products that have complex and violent histories. histories of labor, and exploitation of Black people throughout time, different ways of how capitalism has managed to profit from Black people and culture. So I created these objects out of sugar to point towards those things. You know, I was previously in Richmond, but now I came back to Trinidad. So I lived close to sugarcane fields that were previously sugar plantations under the British Empire. But before the 1800s, they were cotton fields under the Spanish crown. You know, these sugar sculptures, like the one that you see on screen, is part of a 3-part performance that this first part is called But the Real Ones Just Like You, Just Like Me, where I kind of like clean and dissolve these Air Jordan 1s that are made out of hard candy sugar. Next slide. So here's one of the images, like during the performance of me dissolving the shoe using my hands and some water. I also use that like a Danby brush to kind of like clean off the shoe until it completely dissolves. I do this in that same sugarcane field that is kind of like close to my house. You know, just like I was saying before, this is like a 3-part performance or video performance. It's still kind of like trying to figure that out. And during, you know, like thinking throughout like this 3-part performance, I also want to cast these basketballs. This is this specific one. This is a Wilson basketball that I have since I'm a kid. But I'm also interested in casting cutlasses, or, you know, we call it cutlass here, but also machetes. So, you know, the next few slides that I'm about to show you, there are, you know, things that are still kind of like in progress that I'm going to continue working throughout the rest of the year. So, you know, this image right here is a machete that I created during my residency in Puerto Rico, which I was from the beginning of August till the end of August. And I was able to catch various machetes while I was there. You know, in this very specific version, I added cotton to, you know, to the cast to see what would happen during the melting process and to see what would kind of like affect the strength of, you know, once the kind of like the sugar, you know, cool down. So, you know, sugar behaves in a way, once it's like solidified, behaves, you know, once it's boiled to like hard candy and solidifies, it behaves like glass. You know, it breaks and it can cut your skin like it was glass. So I also had the opportunity to collaborate with Bronx-born Afro-Dominican American artist Jillian Rodriguez, and one of the first permanent objects that I created in the past 4 years. You know, most of the objects that I create dissolve, you know, within their nature. They're meant to be these objects that are anti-capitalist, that nobody can buy, nobody can purchase, nobody can possess. So we created this cutlass out of resin, sugar, cotton, and cowrie shells, which is called Eternal Sweetness. These are like a few detailed shots of it. You can see the sugar and the cotton inside here and some of the cowrie shells. And right now, you know, the cutlass is part of Jelane's work, which is a representation of Obatala, which is one of the Yoruba divinities. You know, at the moment, Eternal Sweetness, El Machete, the Obatala is in New York. You know, we share the safekeeping of Obatala's machete for it to only be passed to our families and the ones that come after us. And, you know, in relationship to, you know, those locations that I kind of like I'm interested in, you know, like the sugarcane plantations that are close to my house. While I was in Puerto Rico, I also managed to go to an old sugar factory that it was close to where I was. So this was this is still an untitled performance that I'm kind of working through, where I kind of like reconfigure a whip into a jumping rope. And so I jump the whip until I become exhausted. And, you know, again, like looking at the objects, location, and products that relate to exploitation. And, you know, at the end of the performance, the whip gets tangled onto my arm. So I'm unable to, you know, take the whip off. So it kind of like becomes an extension of my arm. So I no longer need to use my hands to kind of like swing the rope, because it's knotted to my wrist. So I kind of like use my wrist to kind of like jump this rope now. And yeah, that's the end of my presentation. So I'll pass it on to John. Stop sharing.
Hi, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Luis, for sharing, and thank you, everybody, for being here. I'm gonna share my screen real quick. So these are works that I made during my thesis exhibition, and there's these double-sided picture frames with family photos, kind of marking these different moments in time, some that are more ceremonial or ritualistic, and others that are more day-to-day and kind of ubiquitous, like being at the beach. This is more install shots. And I'm sharing this work kind of, we're all kind of sharing these ongoing pieces, because I do want to do a second iteration of this, but include the family photos of a friend of mine. And I forgot to introduce myself. I just realized. John Chae. I'm an artist in Richmond, Virginia, which is on Powhatan land. And so moving on to more relevant information for the show, I was born in the States, but I moved to Korea when I was 8, and I lived there till I was 18. And there I attended an international school started by American missionaries, mainly Presbyterian to Baptist. So with the second iteration of this piece, I want to include the family photos of my good friend Harrison Creech, who has lived in Korea his whole life, though his family is originally from Georgia. And his parents were both Southern Baptist missionaries. He was born in the States, but he moved to Korea when he was 1, and he still lives there. And he's raising his 2 children in Korea. And he's one of several families that I know of, missionary families or descendants of missionaries who continue to live in Korea. So this is to give you an idea of what these works look like, but moving on to some photographs of Harrison's family. Everyone can see this?
Yeah, you can see it.
So Harrison is really generous in sharing these family photos with me. And I think it's really interesting, like the family photograph as like a material, because we obviously are interested in our own family photographs. And there's like, I think in some ways it's kind of like a mirror. It's mirroring our maybe emotional state at the time, or mirroring the way that we might feel about wanting to a state of longing, or wanting to know about a certain history, or also wanting to remember something, or it's a means in which we can show image to our parents, be like, so what's the story behind this? A means which we can kind of share stories. So I don't take it for granted that, I have these family photos of mine, but also that Harrison was willing to share these with me. And I've tried to operate a lot based on coincidence in my practice. Like if a coincidence happens, I kind of want to follow that coincidence. And the coincidence that occurred to me was that Harrison's parents moved to Richmond, and that's when they contacted me. This was like 4 or 5 months ago, letting me know that they moved to Richmond because the Southern Baptist headquarters is in Richmond. So this history of these missionaries coming to Korea that had directly affected my life, I didn't realize that this whole time I was living in Richmond, they had been coming from this city, or they're headquartered in this city. And so there's this coincidence I wanted to follow and see, had a hunch that there was something interesting here. And I'm still got to find that out. I think there's a lot of things I want to tease at, but the words that come to mind are the differences between the perpetual foreigner and the perpetual visitor. And what are the differences in like these states? And also I'm interested, this panel discussion is about on belonging. And I think it's cool that we're all showing these in progress works, because I think it's like this ongoing process of, the missionary as it's the mission is in the word, a mission towards what? Like, what is the missionary's vision? And, missionary is an extension of all these other ideological forces. But me as like questioning my place as somebody who has been converted, or my grandparents, originally from my grandparents. And it's like, what is it for me to be a good Christian or to be a bad Christian, or to be a good American, or to be, what is my responsibility to these ideological forces, but to the people, you know, now that I'm in the States, who have come before me, to the people who are continually coming. I think I need to always kind of have a high level of criticality in terms of what this position is supposed to be. A word that's kind of ringing really strongly for me these days is neo-settler, or like a neo-evangelical. Like, there are things that I'm pushing forward consciously and subconsciously as being important or being truth, and all these previous ideological forces have you know, informed those decisions. So I'm curious in creating like this work that creates a space in which I can confront them and question them, and but also just, you know, that's a personal reason. I think it is interesting to see images like this, because I think they are a little enigmatic, but we also have our, like, whenever we see anybody's family photos, we have our assumptions on like what the story is. I think that's my time though. So thank you for listening.
Yeah, thank you all for just sharing a little bit about your work, having conversation. And I think now we're just gonna start talking amongst one another about just like some common themes, maybe starting with where there's some intersections in how we're thinking about materiality within our work. I know there's like some cross sections, be it with like physicality or with like images or archives, also with soil, with sure. And yeah, we can just start off the conversation that way, I think.
I wonder, do you want to start? You know, especially since, you know, like all the materials that you used throughout the, you know, like each one of us at these, like John, me, and Jackie were using like materials that you are using in this one work. So, you know, what is the kind of like thing that drives you to use all these materials?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a good place to start is I've been using soil for about a year now, and I think I kind of stumbled into using that material because I was it was in the middle of COVID, and I was doing these site specific performances, but then realizing that the material, or like what I was speaking kind of like to this history of these places, and soil seemed to be the best place to kind of like start to interrogate those histories. So one of those performances was actually done in Charlottesville at Penn Park, and started to kind of like investigate these different levels of amnesia with how we are kind of like remembering, how we're remembering, and also in conversation kind of with monuments. So I was doing this performance and using soil as a way to kind of like think through residence time, which Christina Sharp kind of speaks about, but within soil. And I think like that's why it's been such an important material for me, because not only is it able to start talking about kind of like these past histories, but it's also, right, like thinking through the afterlife of slavery. It's like not finished, we're still in it. So it's talking about the past, present, and future simultaneously. So thinking about this collapsion of time. And I think, and this work, again, kind of like that's also being referenced as like this history, even though I think I'm not really speaking to this idea of, I guess I'm not really speaking to this idea of indigeneity per se, but I'm more thinking about the soil, collecting it in these borderlines of thinking about it as like a representation of this in-between space of land when we're thinking about migration, or we're thinking about movement. It's kind of going against that idea of land as possession. So it's starting kind of like this capitalist, anti-ownership, and thinking about those kind of like ambiguous in-between spaces. And I guess like going back to like Jackie, we did this together, this road trip together, and we collected this soil together. And I know a lot of the conversations that we were having during this road trip was about kind of like the ability to be able to do this together. And with Jackie, I don't want to speak for you, but you already mentioned like not like movement, not being able to, you know, until recently be able to have a driver's license, or you're even able to, you know, cross borders easily. And then also doing this road trip back to LA with my mother, who is of alien status, this was like a dream of hers since she was little. So thinking a lot, I guess, too, that also gets brought up with this, just like soil specifically as material, of really kind of like thinking through some of those things of ownership, of movement, and of that. I don't know if that's a good place to start. That was a lot, but we could start there.
Yeah, I think we, like, as you mentioned, I'm also thinking about the word that you just described, you know, like an alien for like an immigration status, and how also we are, you know, thinking about this notion of like a border as a divider instead of a connector, as this place that connects one space with another instead of dividing it. And I think we also talked about this during, you know, the acquiring the soil, like how we were able to be in the space in time, being able to move around like more freely, I will say, that if it was like outside of the United States, and how this like top layer of the soil had all like these recollections of stories that we had the privilege to be in that space during that time. And it's just very fascinating also to see the way that you were able to put together all these soil slabs, and the material, like the connection of the materials that you are using, and thinking about, you know, the title of the show, belonging, and asking me, you know, this question of identity, and where do I belong, not only as like a, you know, as a territory, but also like as a place of as a place of feeling safe, you know, in all this border states, and in all of this surveillance too in the spaces.
Yeah, I think that's like a really good point. And then also just like the way that the soil slabs are created are kind of like mimicking strata or mimicking a core sample. So I think also thinking through kind of like memory in that way, and also the tying of that back to how you're thinking about memory or archives or permanence, I guess, within your practice, Jackie, but also John and Luis. I also like see connections kind of like with temporality and memory there. Either of y'all want to jump in?
I was trying to be polite, but I was waiting for John. So
Go ahead.
I saw your face like maybe he's gonna say something. No, but I also think like like the materials are kind of like fascinating, right? Like I think that like the materials that each one of us are working, we can there's samples, there are archives there. If we do not preserve them, photos, they kind of like they tear apart, they kind of disintegrate. While working with with soil, you have to figure out a way, like experiment how to figure out a way to kind of like keep it together, or what are the other things that I need to add, and it just becomes like this. I think it's there's a lot of in a way it's an act of care, but in a way there's a lot of things that happens us like dedicating our time to these materials, like to these archives, eventually like something that becomes a work. So I think it's interesting to think about material in that way, because it's not an easy material to work with, something that all these materials like have like different histories, they're throughout time they have done many things, we have done things to it as well, we have harvested these materials as well, so it's interesting to think about how all of them kind of like collapse into this into your work, how you have each one of them as as these one work as well. So for me, like like at least the way that I'm kind of like looking at sugar is that for me it's just very close, not only close like geographically, because I have sugar cane literally like 2 minutes away from my house, but also like and within the Caribbean region, and Latin America, it's just such a huge part of our history. So like a lot of enslaved Africans work the land just to harvest cane, and it's something that I think about pretty often, is that I engage with the material, trying for the material to tell me something, but the material, sometimes I just think, this material has nothing to do with it. It was white supremacy, it was human violence that kind of like made us engage with these materials, so it's just interesting to kind of like have a relationship with this thing, I'm talking to this material, constantly trying to mold it, form it, play with it, do something with it, so.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not really going to build off of what Luis was saying, but kind of return back to this idea of like memory and material, specifically with the photographs, because I think all of us are doing that as far as dealing with memory and the material. But I guess more, I just want to pose a question to you, LaRissa, your relationship to these photographs, both historical and personal. I mean, maybe it's me projecting, but it's like for me that whenever I'm engaging with these images, it's always actually, I'm trying to focus on like the present moment. So what are these historical narratives also saying about, or the historical narratives that I draw from them, or the kind of act of fabricating inheritance that happens when I look at these documents of the past? As a group, we had discussed before about unreliable documents or unpredictable documents, unstable documents. So I'm wondering how that informs, or what that reveals about your present too, or like whether it's political or whether it's emotional or spiritual.
Yeah, thank you for that question, John. I think that there's like a never-ending, I think, like ongoing changing relationship to the photographs that were used. Some of them are very kind of like specific to my family narrative. And it's always interesting to go through like family photographs because not all of them, there's always gaps, there's always secrets. I feel like every time I go through these, there's something that I learn or something that's revealed that is constantly influencing or shaping kind of like how I come to understand maybe myself, or like how or like things that I guess that I'm drawn to, or maybe like ingrained into my body's memory that I wasn't able to maybe pinpoint before. And being able to kind of like draw connections that way. But I also think like my use of some of these images have been also just a reflection, I think, of the state that I'm in currently and of the like social political climate right now, like and how that's kind of like influencing I guess like my movements on a daily basis. Like, for example, there are kind of like current images. Like one is kind of like an image of Serena Williams reaching for a tennis ball, and she's wearing the catsuit that she was banned in the French Open. And so that specific image is when she reappears and is wearing that catsuit again in 2021. And that's almost like a commentary for me, like how I'm using that image is not only like, because there was so much, I guess, discussion around kind of like the controversy of her wearing that catsuit. And then also when this work was being made, I was having a lot of conversations with friends, with family, and with the Olympics happening, of just like the blatant attack against Black women in the Olympics, and also drawing connections between that and how growing up, sports, and even now, like sports is a huge part of kind of like my life, and is at one point in my life, I guess, a way that I would have identified as like, I'm a basketball player or whatever. But also just thinking about that history, or like within my family, and then even further thinking about how I guess like the system of sports is used not only within, I think to a certain extent within my family, but even larger, like within the Black community, as one is seen as kind of like this aspiration or like this goal. Like when I was growing up in my household, there was this rule that if we got a scholarship, sports scholarship, we would get a car. So it was like this attaining something, you know, like if you get this, you attain, like it was like this certain, you accomplish certain form of like accomplishment. But also, you know, thinking, I guess in general, just about the relationships of the plantation system to the way the sports system, or like thinking about, there's images of the church that I was born and raised in. And then also if you realize like the way that the installation is set up, I'm calling it a triptych. And so thinking about like these other influences, I guess like on like identity, like formation, and I rambled, so I don't even remember like exactly the first question. But yeah, I think some of the images they're always changing for me. And I think if anything, they're like a specific, it's just commenting kind of like on this, my state and how I'm physically kind of like navigating right now.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think for me, a lot of times when I look at these old family photographs or try to interrogate images of like, why am I interested in this image, or what is this image saying to me? It's a means for me to kind of reveal. I mean, it's kind of like a silent therapist maybe, or like reveal like what's kind of running underneath, like as far as aspirations or anxieties, or especially when I look at images of church or military photographs, because military life is a huge component in Korean culture, and also just the history of the Pacific Rim in general. What is it, you know, what does it say about like what I'm afraid of not achieving, or afraid of not fitting in a certain way, and what's the history of this feeling? Because it's still very much playing out in the present, even if I have no intention to join the military. So and it's interesting, like what you're bringing up in terms of sports, because I feel like there's a lot of conversation right now pushing back against model minority myth, and I wonder like if sometimes we're framing the conversation incorrectly, because it's not that the model minority myth is fake, it's that actually the model minority myth, the pressure is very real.
Yeah.
So what is it about your need to perform when you arrive here? Isn't that like the more important question? Because for a lot of us, we feel like we actually cannot underachieve. Or also we are in positions of having achieved because there was immense pressure to do it. So I'm wondering, like, you know, if we constantly, these images are kind of reminding me that of, you know, everyone standing at attention and everyone being like a good American or good Korean, you know. But yeah.
I think is, I don't know, I think it's interesting to think about, you know, migrant stories, because, you know, my family has moved quite a bit. And, you know, it's like, I remember being a kid and, you know, you kind of like hear about Sueño Americano. So, you know, you move to the States, para el Sueño Americano. So the American dream of the thing, and my family was one of those, you know, you move for that. And you see like the failure of the American dream, and we leave again, because the American dream, we failed the dream and the dream failed us, you know. So it's, you know, it's like, and that entire thing, you know, it's always at the back of my mind, but I'm always thinking about, you know, that what is at the back of my mind is that I always have to succeed, be successful. I always need to figure it out however I can, you know, because there's not a space for me to fail, because if it fails, like, it all crumbles, you know. So, but, you know, at the opposite of that thing, there's always this thing. It's like, where do we, you know, is there a chance to rest, you know, because even within moments of rest, you're thinking about achievement. There's never a space to kind of like just lay down and just your mind be completely blank. Because sometimes, I don't know, it happens to me. It's like, oh, I'm gonna rest, but I'm just gonna pull this book here because I need to know what I'm gonna do tomorrow and what I'm gonna do, what's gonna be part of this other thing that I'm gonna do. So, you know, I think that there is a privilege in like disconnect, and there's a privilege in within rest and leisure, and you know, who has access to leisure, who has access to rest, and, you know, who can nap, you know. So.
Yeah, like I think I've been thinking a lot about like whose labor is creating like the leisure, like especially I guess like in relationship to some of these sports that I guess are associated more with leisure, such as like golf or tennis, and also like access in that way. I know like when Jackie and I were driving, I think at a certain point we started like counting how many like golf courses we were like seeing on like the borderlines of like it would be absolutely nothing and then like this beautifully maintained like golf course, which was like really interesting. I don't know, Jackie. I feel like we talked about a lot in our road trip together, but thinking also, I guess, about labor and leisure and the work that I guess you're creating right now.
Yeah, and I know we talk about this as a group as like generational trauma. Like for me, when I hear like a golf course, I think about these golf courses that are like dividing the border between Mexico and the US. And then we have, you know, this reality on one side where everything is green and has water, but in the other side, you see people trying to cross the river to, you know, run into this place of leisure. And like, as you mentioned, LaRissa, it was like we were trying to, you know, we have all this vast land that is mainly like desert. And then you see all these golf courses full of greenish and water and like people enjoying their time. And, you know, people of color taking care of the land around that. And as you mentioned that, I think it was you, John, as you know, about this feeling, you know, about how we feel like witnessing to all of this. It's not an event, but all this like realities and this feeling that like it feels that is like we feel that we know it, but it's just we don't know exactly where it comes from. It can be from previous trauma that we actually lived, or it could be something that is genetic, that is just being passed on to us. And how also like verbal narratives are so important, because I find out like not too long ago that my grandfather, my dad's side of the family, when he was a 7-year-old.
We lose Jackie.
We lost Jackie. No.
Oh no!
Yeah,
Oh,
we
you're
got
back.
you back.
Saying, you were saying your
Okay,
grandfather is 7
okay.
years old.
Okay, yeah. So he had to walk for like roughly 60 miles, you know, as a 7-year-old boy, because he was an orphan, to move from one location to another location in order to, you know, survive. And there's like fight and fly mode, you know, that is being passed on to us, where we are like, oh, you know, like, no, we cannot rest, because, you know, we need to like pull that book, like we said, you know, to make sure that we're gonna have all that context and we know what we're talking about. And yeah, so I found that yeah, I keep thinking about that. I think it's interesting.
Yeah, and I think like on that line, it's like, and I think John, at least you're mentioning this for, it's not necessarily like rest because you've reached a destination. It's more like rest to keep going. It's like a regeneration to like it's like you're constantly like in, you know, you're constantly in it. You're never like arriving. So it feels like the rest is momentary. And I think that's like interesting, I guess, to think about too, because I feel like we're kind of because like regeneration maybe is more kind of like the right word, but I'm not sure, like can't quite pinpoint it.
I mean, specifically talking about golf, I think that's really interesting because, you know, if you and generational trauma or these generational histories, like it's interesting because I think a lot of times people playing golf are like continually trying to convince themselves. I mean, maybe they just love golf, but they're trying to convince themselves that they've made it, or like that they're safe, or like that they're really enjoying nature right now, and it's like, or like really, maybe I'm not giving golf enough credit, but it's interesting, like, you know, mapping these histories. It's like, if I were to look at all these photographs of multi-generations, like, when it comes to movement and mobility, it's like a grandfather who had, you know, forcefully conscripted and moved to a location because of colonization, to having to be a war refugee, to father taking like an incredible economic opportunity, and all these aspirations towards, we need to be better than before and safer than before and not let these traumas reoccur. And to my generation of kids that I grew up with who love golf, and it's like, why do you love golf so much? And it's like, because I think they're convincing themselves, like, and it's also interesting because I think they're so afraid of so many other things. Like, I don't think they like camping at all or hiking as much, but they love golf. And it's like, I think there's something there that's happening of, and I think this question of like, when you're confronting these memories, I think it's another important question is like, what decision do you make at that point? Is it about honoring, or is it about dismantling, or is it about, maybe you're doing both, or is it about questioning yourself too in that moment? So.
Not to drag the sports conversation too long, but I think it's just interesting to, you know, think about it, especially being, you know, I was born in Venezuela, moved to Trinidad, moved to the US, and back to the Caribbean region. And just thinking about how that idea of, you know, kind of to tap into these things in order to kind of like, you know, escape so it's a very a socioeconomic status, right? You know, you either come a basketball player. In Latin America, it's more, yeah, you become a football player. But it's interesting that the idea of becoming a basketball player is also exported through US media that we consume so much. So I was one of those kids that kind of like thought, I was like, I can become an NBA player, not knowing, you know, as a kid that, you know, I'm not even in the country where I would get, you know, signed into a deal. So, but along with that, you know, and that's one of the reasons why I kind of like cast the Air Jordan 1. It's like, you know, that thing that gets exported within culture, that, you know, this is the thing, and this is the thing that goes attached to being an NBA player. You know, it's this product, this shoe, this thing, you know, this idea that you can be that person. And this you know, it's like it's and it's so far away, so far attainable, that that I don't know, it's like just becomes such an unrealistic expectation to kind of, at least it became for me, to kind of like do that, you know. So um which is interesting. So it's like, what are the thing that I need to do, because it's not going to be sports, because so what is the other thing that I need to kind of like tap into to kind of like get out of a situation really quick. So
Yeah. And I
and
think that
sorry, and just one more thing. And that's the reason, no, and that's the reason why it's kind of interesting to think about. And that's where you move. You just leave the place where you are, and you just go to the place where the things are supposedly happening. Like, according, you know, you think that the grass is green at somewhere else, but it's not. So yeah.
Yeah. And I think like that question, John, that you were asking about, it's like, are you trying to like dismantle the thing? Are you trying to reinvent the thing? Like, what is it that you do to kind of like try to escape that, or to pinpoint, or and I feel like that is something that I was interesting about the materiality of like the soil and the sugar and the person in general, is because the sugar, as Luis was mentioning before, it's really hard to preserve it. It, like, traveling across the country with that was very difficult. I was putting like ice packs in it at one point so that when it got to the gallery, it would be in a condition to where that it could like support the soil, which was really difficult. But thinking about kind of like this changing state of the material, in a way acting as like these different forms of like abolishing or like dismantling or transforming, like the sugar isn't meant that the the slab with the sugar at the bottom, the sugar isn't meant to kind of like stay in the state that it is now, and it is meant to kind of like dissolve over the course of the show. Or like even thinking about going back to like the conversation about like labor and leisure, it's like the celosia planted like within that slab can only survive off of like the labor or the care given by the gallery, right? Because I'm like not in this space in order for it to live. So like also kind of like, I guess like thinking about like these different forms of survival, or like different ways like these materials are, you know, kind of like speaking to that as well. I think is like something interesting that started to happen that I only happened in the space.
Something that's really interesting to me when you incorporated the porcelain. You didn't mention this specifically, but it's something that's like a new realization for me from this specific book that I did want to, so I kind of wanted to share it. But it's like porcelain and China's relationship to tea, and then of course tea's relationship to sugar. And this kind of globalized reality that was happening that is still playing out today, in which we are all interconnected in these this game in which we're set to compete against each other as far as labor. Like this history goes on has been going on for a long time. That's, I mean, I don't have much further to say than that, but it is interesting how like you had the intuition to bring that into, you know, and it's
yeah, I was really, I guess, like interested in that relationship between sugar and porcelain, and kind of like that shared history and how it's kind of like aided in capitalism, but also like porcelain is super pure. So structurally, it's really hard to make things on that scale. So I think we were earlier talking about this like model minority myth, and also kind of like thinking about the way that porcelain is kind of like displayed within like a museum setting or within fine china, like this subtle, I guess the way that like it is used to kind of like represent this dainty, fragile like material that is on display kind of like within these settings, and using that as like a base or support for the soil. And I think like was something that was also kind of like interesting to me, is like something that would be on display and on top is then now supporting, you know, this soil on the bottom is like the support system. And also like thinking through, I guess, like those that history that you were mentioning as well. I think we're almost at time. We have like 10 more minutes. I don't know if we there's a few questions, but we can also just continue to talk.
That was fast.
We knew we were gonna run out of time.
Should we look at the question?
Yeah.
Who wants to read?
I can read. I guess I'll start with the first one. It says, I was interested in what John was saying about following coincidence, and I'm wondering how all of you might or might not be doing similar things in your work, as in, are there moments that the work speaks back to you in a way that causes you to reroute your plans and processes? Can you speak to how the specific work you are showing has evolved and changed since its inception? Someone want to start?
I think I don't know, at least like me working with sugar is like always like a complete, it's always a conversation. Not a conversation, but always like let me just make sure that I don't know, between you and I, we've shared immense amount of recipes. Not only with you, I've shared recipes with a lot of people. So what are the things that we can kind of like add to the recipe of the sugar so it can give us, this, you know, this a very specific color, or, for it to be more transparent. What happens when you don't pour corn syrup into it? It just becomes like this very opaque thing. Or, even like the transportation of it. I know, we also had a lot of conversations of you going across the country with the sugar, and I was like, I don't know if it's gonna make it. Like, I never thought it was gonna make it. I really didn't think it was gonna make it. I was surprised that it did. But while I was in Puerto Rico, I burnt a lot of sugar while I was there. And like, such a simple thing is like, the sugar that I buy here in Trinidad, interestingly enough, because we no longer make sugar, because the sugar factories went bankrupt, and we no longer export sugar to the UK. Now we import sugar from Jamaica and Belize, right? So it's interesting to use this, either, I guess, Jamaican sugar is the one that we're just using, very specific brand, and then go to Puerto Rico and use like another brand that I can't remember what the label used to say, but then just like it's how such a small change, it just kind of like threw off my entire recipe, and I kind of like had to adjust the things that I was doing. Like the corn syrup that I was using in Puerto Rico was lighter. The one that I use here is is thicker. So it just gives me different results. And and that kind of like it's interesting to think how the material kind of like pushes you in very specific directions, but not only the material but also the weather. Talking about specifically thinking that I know that you put bags of ice, and when you told me that, I was like, oh, you shouldn't do that at all, because it's gonna, the condensation itself is just gonna eat it. Because I've put it in the freezer and I've seen it happen. So just the material just kind of like guides you, because the material is always, it's a continuous act of care, but there's also a lot of wrestling that is happening at the same time. Because you're kind of like, oh, I'm trying to preserve you to a certain extent, but then the material's like, nah, I'm gone. Like, I'm gonna melt, I'm gonna bend, I'm gonna become liquid. I'm just gonna do the things that I need to do. It's like there's like very little control, so it's always like an act of control and release, control and release. So, and all that just leads you to something that just becomes like a very specific amount of time. It's no longer going to exist. It's just that amount of time. So yeah, sorry that long. It was a very long answer. Sorry.
Did anybody else want to say something on coincidence? I'll just chime in really quick because I'm the one that said it. But I think sometimes I like to introduce my work as being investigating something that's actually like really simple, like a very simple statement, like why is my name John Hee Taek Chae, and like in that order, like why does John come first? And something very simple, I think, can open up a lot of different meanings. So I think with coincidence too, it's like a moment that feels magical, or a moment that feels like, wow, that's fate. But it's like, in some ways, like, yeah, it's fate. It's fate because all these things are at play. That coincidence, like, I think you can, it still has a moment of inspiration after you've done all the research and you're like, oh, well, it's not, yeah, like I'm in Richmond because, and Richmond is a lot of where this project of conversion is spreading throughout because of there's all this other history. Anyways, that's all it's too much right now towards the end to unpackage why Richmond is the way it is, or like why this sort of ideological force might be coming out of Richmond. But yeah.
I think we have a few more minutes. Maybe we'll go to the second question. It says, what John said made me wonder, all of you are working with past historical and personal archives. Do you consciously try to build an archive of this moment or of your lives now? Do you see your artwork as an archive of sorts?
I feel like me and John spoke on the last question. Maybe we should leave this question to Jackie.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna start by saying that I mentioned this to the group, like I have no photos of me as a little girl. I have no photos of my grandfather or my grandmother in any periods of their lives. So for me, I think it's really interesting to be able to put together an archive of all this erasure that has happened historically, and also being able to create this work that is not speaking about just my stories, speaking about Latin American diaspora and the stories of many people right now currently seeking asylum at the border. And being able to put this into words, into context, in either on paper or material, I think it's really empowering, and is in a way it feels fulfilling to be able to create this work. And I don't know if it's specifically making space, but being able to tell a story, being able to not be afraid to speak up and describe things as they are felt and live, without having someone else tell the story for me. So I think it's not just a personal archive, but it's also a way of documenting what has been erased, or what people have been afraid to talk about. I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in and say something else.
I just want to add like a small thing. It's just interesting to think about, think about the archive and think about our lives as archives, and kind of like thinking about the work that we make as a way of kind of like filling the gap and within that archive, So like, I think Rinaldo Walcott speaks about that. It's like, the things that we kind of like creating within art, it's like we do it, either collapse in time, but we can kind of create what goes into that gap in there. So, but also thinking about my practice as something that disappears. So I don't know. It's just interesting to think about the documentation that I have within my work as the only evidence of a gesture or something that existed, which kind of like in a way like repeats that same gesture of erasure. But at the same time, I think about it because they're objects. I think about it in relationship to monuments, that they're so solid and they're so permanent. And, and my time in this earth is so short that I just don't want to be that person who left the thing there. So people have to deal with it. So, it's just, I have to leave physical space to other people to be here as well. So.
Yeah, I think maybe that's a good place to end. I feel like the conversation could keep going because I have a thought on that comment, but it is 4:15 my time, which means on the West Coast, so it's 7:15 on the East Coast. And I know that's when we said we'd be wrapping up. So I do want to be conscious of everyone's time and thank everyone for coming out, and also for Jackie, Luis, and John for having this very candid, open conversation with with me surrounding this work, but then also to just have a space to be in conversation with you all is always great. So yeah, we're done. And thank everyone out there. I wish I could see your faces, but I don't. But thank you all for coming tonight.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, LaRissa, for inviting us, and thank you, Second Street Gallery, for also hosting us and this conversation. Thank you, Kristen. I know you're behind us. So.
Bye, y'all.
Have a good night, everyone. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.